Okay, so today we're taking a deep dive into value pluralism.
Okay.
And I think that the term pluralism itself might be familiar to you, maybe from political philosophy,
Yes.
but we're specifically going to be talking about moral value pluralism.
Right.
So not so much like, are different ways of life okay to coexist in a society, but like, are the things that we call good in fundamentally different ways?
Yeah. So we can think about in the U.S. we have some semblance of political pluralism.
Yeah.
People with very different views can live together and participate in the government, and that's great.
Yeah.
But moral value pluralism is a much deeper thesis about, the fundamental nature of value itself.
Yeah. And it's really important to say right off the bat that we are not talking about like any kind of moral relativism here.
Right.
This isn't like saying that, all values are equally valid or anything like that.
Right.
It's a pretty specific claim about how the values that we take to be true are structured.
That's right.
And so a really central question that we're going to be wrestling with is, um, when we talk about like happiness or liberty or friendship or knowledge or beauty,
Right.
um, are all of those just different expressions of one single underlying value?
Mm-hmm.
Or are there really many different fundamental values that can't be reduced to one?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Yeah.
We often divide up, moral theories into like consequentialist and deontological and virtue ethical theories.
Right.
But the concept of value is kind of neutral between those theories.
Right.
So a consequentialist could be a moral value pluralist or a someone who thinks there's just one value.
Right.
And the same thing for a deontologist or a virtue ethicist.
Right. So it's kind of like a more fundamental level
Holistic,
question.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we might ask, like, are there many different moral principles, or is there just one moral principle? And that would be a question about value pluralism.
Right.
But it would apply to different moral theories.
Right. And we often think of utilitarianism as being kind of the classic example of a monistic theory, right?
Right, that's right.
Like well-being is the one.
Exactly.
Right.
Right. So you might think that things like friendship are only good because they lead to well-being.
Right. They're instrumental.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even utilitarians can be value pluralists.
Right.
So, for example, Amartya Sen, who's a very famous economist and philosopher,
Right.
He argues for a kind of what he calls a vector view of utility,
Okay.
where there are different kinds of utility that can't be reduced to one.
Okay. So not just like more or less
Yeah,
of the same thing.
exactly.
But like different categories.
Different categories of utility.
Yeah. Okay.
So that would be an example of a utilitarian who's also a value pluralist.
Right. And then some people even think that well-being itself
Right.
is plural.
That's right.
So it's not even like that well-being is the one thing.
Yeah.
But that well-being has like many constituent parts
Right.
that are irreducibly plural.
That's right.
So there's a distinction that's made between foundational and non-foundational pluralism.
That's right.
And could you just sort of explain what that distinction is all about?
Yeah. So foundational pluralism is the stronger claim.
Okay.
It says that at the most basic level of morality, there are just many different values.
Okay.
And there's no one value that subsumes all the others.
Okay.
So there's no sort of like one property of goodness
Right.
that everything that's good has.
Right.
Or there's no like one principle
Right.
that explains why all of the good things are good.
Right.
Non-foundational pluralism is a weaker claim.
Okay.
It says that at the level of like our choices
Right.
and our experience, there are many different values, but they might all ultimately be explained in terms of one more fundamental value.
Right. So it's like the analogy I always use is like a tree, right? Where foundational pluralism is like there are many different trees. And non-foundational pluralism is there's one tree with many branches.
Exactly.
Okay.
And those branches might look very different.
Right.
But they all come from the same root.
Right. Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
So one person who argues for foundational pluralism is Judith Jarvis Thompson.
Right.
And what's the kind of main thrust of her argument against there being one single property of goodness?
Yeah, so she's pushing back against this idea that was very popular among philosophers in the early 20th century,
Right.
championed by G.E. Moore,
Right.
who thought that goodness was this simple, non-natural property. And
Right.
so he thought that you could just see that something was good.
Right.
Like you could see that it was yellow.
Right.
And Thompson thinks this is really problematic.
Okay.
And she points to all the different ways that we use the word good.
Right.
So we talk about a good pen, a good argument, a good friend.
Right.
And she thinks that there's just something fundamentally different about the way that goodness applies in all of these different cases.
Yeah.
So her famous line is, all goodness is a goodness in a way.
Okay.
So a pen is good in a certain way.
Right.
An argument is good in a different way, and a friend is good in yet a different way. And she thinks that these ways of being good are just fundamentally plural,
Right.
and they can't be reduced to one,
Right.
kind of overarching property.
Yeah, so it's almost like an argument from the semantics of how we talk about goodness.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And then another foundational pluralist that our sources highlight is W.D. Ross.
Right.
And he kind of comes at it from a different angle.
That's right.
How does his work contribute to this argument for pluralism?
Yeah, so Ross is really famous for this idea of prima facie duties,
Okay.
which are duties that we have,
Right.
but that can be overridden by other duties.
Okay.
So some examples are like duties of fidelity, reparation, gratitude, beneficence,
Right.
non-injury, self-improvement. So these are all things that, seem like we have a duty to do them, but they can conflict with each other. And when they do, we have to figure out which one is more important.
Right.
But Ross thought that these prima facie duties were themselves fundamentally plural.
Okay.
So there's no one principle that explains
Right.
why we have all of these duties.
Right.
They're just, kind of brute facts about morality.
Okay, so this is sometimes called Ross-style pluralism.
That's right.
Okay.
And it's a very strong form of pluralism because it says
Right.
not only are there many values,
Right.
but there are also many duties.
Okay.
And these duties don't reduce to one another.
So they're kind of like different categories of moral,
That's right.
imperative, yeah.
Okay.
Now, G.E. Moore, despite the fact that we talk about so many things being good,
Right.
he's actually categorized as a foundational monist.
Right. That's right.
So how do those two things
Yeah.
go together?
Yeah. Well, he thought that, so even though there are lots of different good things,
Right.
he thought that they were all good
Yeah.
because they instantiated this one property of goodness.
Correct.
And so goodness itself was this simple, non-natural property.
Right.
And it was just a matter of how much goodness something had
Right.
that determined how good it was.
Right. Okay.
But he also had this really interesting idea of organic unities,
Okay.
which basically says that,
Oh, wait.
sometimes when you combine good things together,
Right.
they become even more good
Okay.
than you would expect just by adding up their individual goodness.
Okay.
So he gives the example of love and friendship.
Okay.
So if you have love and friendship together,
Right.
that's better than just having love on its own and
Right.
friendship on its own.
Right. So it's not just like 1 + 1 = 2. It's like 1 + 1 = 3 or
Exactly. Yeah, you get this,
yeah.
kind of synergistic effect.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And then John Stuart Mill, there's some debate about
Right.
whether he should be considered a foundational pluralist or a monist.
That's right.
What are the arguments on both sides of that?
Yeah, so the argument for Mill being a pluralist comes from his famous distinction between higher and lower pleasures,
Okay.
right? So he says that, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied
Right.
than a pig satisfied.
Right.
And the thought is that there's something just qualitatively better
Right.
about the pleasures of the mind
Right.
than the pleasures of the body.
Right.
And so if that's right,
Yeah.
then there might be different kinds of pleasure
Right.
that can't be reduced to one.
Right. So it's not just more or less of the same thing.
Right. It's a different kind of pleasure altogether.
Okay.
The argument that Mill is a monist
Right.
comes from his appeal to competent judges. So he says that the way to determine which pleasures are better is to ask people who have experienced both
Right.
and see which ones they prefer.
Right.
And so the thought is that
Yeah.
maybe what's really going on is that there's just one kind of pleasure.
Right.
But some people are better at judging
Right.
how much pleasure something will give.
Right.
And so when they say that higher pleasures are better,
Right.
what they're really saying is that those pleasures will give you more pleasure in the long run.
Okay. So that would be a way of like making it all about one kind of thing.
Right. Exactly.
But it's still like the competent judges are kind of the ones determining that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So before we move on to like the attraction of pluralism,
Yeah.
there's this interesting distinction that the sources make between decision procedures and criteria of right action. And could you just explain a little bit about how that distinction is relevant to the discussion about pluralism versus monism?
Yeah. So a criterion of right action is like what ultimately makes an action right or wrong.
Okay.
Right. So for a utilitarian, the criterion of right action is maximizing happiness.
Right.
For a deontologist, it might be something like following the categorical imperative.
Right.
A decision procedure is like a rule of thumb that you can use to figure out what the right thing to do is. So a utilitarian might have a decision procedure that says, keep your promises.
Right.
Even if it doesn't maximize happiness in this particular case.
Right.
Because in the long run, keeping your promises will tend to maximize happiness.
Right. So it's like a shortcut that usually leads to the right thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And so the distinction is relevant to the discussion about pluralism and monism, because even a monist might have a decision procedure that appeals to many different values.
Okay.
So, for example, a utilitarian might say, well, when you're deciding what to do, you should consider the consequences for happiness, but you should also consider whether you're keeping your promises, whether you're being fair, whether you're being honest, and so on.
Right.
And so even though they think that ultimately there's just one value, they might have a decision procedure that appeals to many different values.
Okay, so that's how it gets more complicated.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to the attraction of pluralism.
Okay.
What are some of the reasons why people find this view so compelling?
Yeah, so one of the main reasons is that it just seems to fit better with our experience of morality.
Right.
So we often feel like we're torn between different values that can't be easily compared.
Right.
And it's hard to see how that could be the case.
Right.
If there's really just one fundamental value.
Right.
Right. So if the only thing that matters is happiness, then it seems like it should always be clear, what the right thing to do is.
Right. Just do the thing that produces the most happiness.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's often not how it feels.
Right. It doesn't feel like we're just adding up units of happiness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so pluralists think that this experience of,
Right.
Being torn between different values is evidence that those values are fundamentally plural.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So one specific thing that pluralists point to is discontinuities.
Right.
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so a discontinuity is basically the idea that, some values are just so different that no amount of one value can make up for the loss of even a small amount of another value. So Mill's example of higher and lower pleasures is a good example of this.
Okay.
Right. So he says that no amount of lower pleasures can make up for the loss of even a small amount of higher pleasure.
Right.
Right. So no amount of pushpin is going to be as good as, reading Shakespeare.
Right. Even a little bit of Shakespeare.
Exactly.
Is going to be better than a ton of pushpin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so pluralists think that this shows that, higher and lower pleasures are just on different scales. They're not just, different amounts of the same thing. They're just fundamentally different kinds of things.
Right. So there's some sort of qualitative difference that can't just be quantified. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Our sources also talk about Ruth Chang's work on organic unities.
Right.
And how that contributes to pluralism.
Yeah. So Chang's idea is that values interact with each other in these really complex ways.
Okay.
And that it's not always the case that more of one value is better.
Okay.
So she has this example of, imagine you're planning a vacation.
Okay.
And you can either go to the beach.
Right.
Or you can go to the mountains.
Okay.
And, the beach is going to be really relaxing. The mountains are going to be really exciting.
Right.
But she thinks that it's not obvious that just having more relaxation or more excitement
Right.
is necessarily better.
Right.
Right. So you might have a vacation that's like too relaxing, or you might have a vacation that's too exciting.
Right. You need like a balance of the two.
Right. And so she thinks that this shows that,
Right.
values aren't just these things that you can just like add up.
Right.
And the more you have, the better.
Right.
It's really about like
Right.
finding the right balance between different values.
It's almost like they're interacting like chemically, right? Where
exactly.
if you have too much of one, it's like it throws the whole thing off.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then another kind of important concept that gets brought up is this idea of incommensurability or incomparability.
Right.
And could you explain a little bit about what that means?
Yeah. So incommensurability basically means that
Okay.
you can't compare two things
Okay.
on the same scale,
Okay.
right? So like you can't compare,
Right.
apples and oranges. They're just different kinds of fruit.
Right.
Incomparability is even stronger.
Okay.
It says that you can't even say which one is better,
Okay.
right? So like you might think
Yeah.
that, happiness and freedom are incomparable.
Okay.
You can't say that one is better than the other.
Right.
They're just different kinds of good.
Right.
And so you can't really choose between them
Okay.
on the basis of which one is better.
Right. So how is that relevant to the discussion about
Yeah.
pluralism?
So pluralists often appeal to incommensurability
Okay.
to argue for their view,
Okay.
right? Because if values are incommensurable,
Right.
then it's hard to see how they could all be reduced
Right.
to one fundamental value.
Right.
Right? So like if happiness and freedom are incommensurable,
Right.
then it's hard to see how they could both be,
Right.
just different amounts of the same thing,
Right.
like well-being or something like that.
Right. They have to be fundamentally different.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the next thing that really stuck out to me in the sources was this idea of
Okay.
value conflicts and rational regret.
Right.
Can you explain a little bit about what that argument is?
Yeah. So the idea is that
It's a-
sometimes we have to make choices
Right.
where we have to sacrifice one value for another.
Right.
And even if we make the right choice,
Okay.
we might still rationally regret the value that we had to sacrifice.
Okay.
And so the thought is that this is hard to explain on a monistic view,
Okay.
right? So if there's only one value,
Right.
then why would we ever regret,
Right.
sacrificing one value for another?
Right.
Right, because we would just be getting more of that one value.
Right. It would just be like a matter of like, I got 80 units of the good instead of 70 units of the good.
Exactly, yeah. But that's often not how it feels.
Right.
Right? We often feel like we've lost something
Right.
that can't be replaced,
Right.
even if we've gained something else that's good.
Right.
And so pluralists think that this is evidence
Right.
that there are just different kinds of good
Oh,
that
yeah.
can't be reduced to one.
Right. So it's like, even if I made the right choice,
Right.
it's still appropriate to feel sad about the thing that I had to give up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you give an example of that kind of thing?
Yeah. So Stalker gives the example of, imagine you have a friend
Okay.
who's really sick,
Okay.
and you can either stay home and take care of them,
Right.
or you can go to a conference
Right.
where you're going to learn a lot about your field
Right.
and advance your career.
Right.
And let's say that it's clear that,
Right.
the right thing to do is to stay home and take care of your friend.
Right.
But Stalker thinks that it would still be rational to regret
Right.
the opportunity to go to the conference.
Right.
Right, because you're missing out on something
Right.
that's genuinely good.
Right.
And that's not just like,
Right.
a matter of like getting less of some other good. It's a
Okay.
matter of like
Right.
losing a different kind of good altogether.
Right. So it's like friendship is good and knowledge is good,
Exactly.
but they're good in different ways.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Our sources also talk about this connection between
Okay.
pluralism and acrasia. So weakness of the will, right?
Right. Yeah.
And the idea that like pluralism might be able to explain why we sometimes act against our better judgment.
Right. Yeah. So the thought is that,
Yeah.
sometimes we do things that we know are bad for us.
Right.
And it's hard to see how that could be the case if
Right.
we only care about one thing.
Right.
Like if we only care about happiness,
Yeah.
then why would we ever do something that makes us unhappy?
Right.
But if there are many different values,
Right.
then we might be pulled in different directions
Right.
by those different values.
Right.
And so we might end up doing something
Right.
that we know is bad for us overall,
Right.
but that satisfies some other value
Right.
that
Yeah.
we care about.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the source is also kind of pushed back on that argument a little bit, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It's not clear that
Yeah.
pluralism is actually needed
Yeah.
to explain acrasia.
So Stalker himself, who's a, big proponent of value pluralism,
Right.
doesn't think that this argument from acrasia is actually a good argument.
Okay.
He thinks that, even if there's only one value,
Right.
we might still do things that are bad for us
Okay.
because we're weak-willed,
Right.
or because we're just not paying attention,
Right.
or because we're just,
Right.
not thinking clearly in the moment.
Right. So it
Yeah.
doesn't actually require us to posit different
Right.
fundamental values.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The last thing that our sources talk about in terms of, the attraction of pluralism
Okay.
is this idea of appropriate responses to value.
Okay.
And could you explain a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, so the idea is that
Yeah.
different values call for different responses.
Okay.
Right. So, for example, if you value friendship,
Right.
then you're going to treat your friends in a certain way.
Right.
If you value knowledge, then you're going to treat knowledge in a different way.
Right.
Right. And so the thought is that
Right.
these different responses are not just a matter of,
Right.
like how much you value the thing.
Right.
They're really a matter of like what kind of thing it is.
Right.
Right. So you don't treat your friends
Right.
the same way you treat knowledge,
Right.
even if you value them both equally.
Right.
And so the thought is that this is hard to explain
Right.
on a monistic view.
Okay.
Right. Because if there's only one value,
Right.
then it seems like, the way you respond to something
Right.
should just be a function of
Right.
how much you value it.
Right.
But that's not how it seems to work
Right.
in practice.
Right. It seems like there are different modes
Yeah,
of relating.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah. So one example that our sources give is, the difference between honoring and promoting a value.
Okay. So we honor a promise by keeping it,
Right.
but we promote happiness by trying to create more of it.
Right.
Right. And so those are just
Right.
different kinds of responses
Right.
to different kinds of values.
Right. It's not like I can promote a promise
But-
or honor happiness.
Exactly. Yeah.